So Alberta and some of the other provinces in Canada are sort of in talks right now about secession, potentially seceding. What hurdles would they actually have to jump to make that happen? We're going to be doing a deep dive into that today. We're also going to look at one of the most recent hurdles that has kind of risen above the rest, at least right now, that could put a shutdown to this entire process. But we're also going to be talking about the psychological implications of trying to secede from your nation, your country. What would that look like psychologically at an individual level? So stick around and we're going to get into this. Ryan, what do you got for us today?
All right. So, yeah, we're going to jump right into this. So we see here a nice map of Canada. And what we are talking about today is Alberta. And we're also going to get a little bit into Saskatchewan and potentially implications for British Columbia. But really, we want to focus on what's going on with Alberta here. And we're talking about literally discussions of secession and potentially joining the U.S. Well, we'll see. That would be a separate conversation. But there have been some serious developments here recently that make it seem a lot more than just political posturing. So we want to dive into real quickly here some of the economic reasons and justifications, some of the political reasons, and the cultural reasons. And so, and then we're going to have Troy give us a surprising thing, a hurdle that needs to be overcome. And so we're just going to dive right into these here. But, first, I just want to mention, Alberta, I heard they are called the Texas of Canada. So you can get your mind what that means, the Texas of Canada. And I know y'all are in Texas. And so you can give us a feel for the psychology that happens in Texas. This is Texas. So I think that it's going to be, I can bring that out all day. I got a lot more where that came from, but
I'm feeling highly offended right now. Just so you know.
Look, yeah, well, everybody's snowflakes here, I guess. So, okay. So we're going to go ahead and, look at the economic factors here. Okay, so Alberta has sent $540 billion to the rest of Canada over the past 23 years. Alberta is 12% of Canada's population, and it contributes 17% of the federal tax revenue. And so that is 43% more than their share, if you do the fancy math on that. And so Alberta annually sends 17 to 27 billion more to Ottawa, the capital of Canada, than it receives back. And for example, Nova Scotia gets 1.7 billion in equalization payments, and that's about 30% of its provincial budget. And so that's much funded by the Alberta oil revenue. And so you can see we have a lot of that happening. We have some of that similar in the U.S., where you have states like California that have lots of debt and can't even run their own state, versus other states that have no debt and actually even have surplus, like Iowa. And so here we have Alberta. This says net income contribution to Ottawa. So this one, 244 billion from 2007. So I gave another number here because it's a different time frame. But you can see this is just insane. Alberta, British Columbia, Ontario, and on down the line. And so kind of a big deal here. So
it's crazy there's only 3 provinces that fund their entire government. And then the rest of the provinces are just like they're just taking the money from those 3 provinces.
They're mooches, man. They're mooches.
That's crazy.
It is.
Yeah. So if you look at this is a lot of oil in the energy sector. So Alberta's energy sector in 2024 was worth $140 billion annually, and they contributed $70 billion to Canada's GDP, and massive numbers here. So if the blocked pipelines had been built, so Keystone, Northern Gateway, and Energy East, if those had been built, Alberta would have added another 2.5 million barrels per day capacity. That's 55 billion GDP annually and 17 billion extra for Alberta's government. So kind of consequential to not have built those pipelines. And that's a whole nother topic, but we need to get into some of you guys have any comments on this here? And then we're going to get into some of the survey stuff. What do people say?
My first thought is, imagine if we saw a graph like this living here in the States, where it was very clear that some of the states were being 100% funded or close to 100% funded by revenue coming from other states. Like, imagine if that was the case. Yeah. And I know there's, the graph is going to look a little bit like this, but maybe not this extreme. But man, that is just crazy to think about.
Yeah, my initial instinct on that is that's not looking good for any seceding, because if they're providing that much, the rest of Canada is not about to let that go anytime soon.
Right. They're going to fight really hard to keep them around.
Yeah, because
And,
that's
keep,
detrimental
and
at
keep
that
them in
point.
chains, essentially.
Maybe if
Right.
Quebec was seceding, they'd be like, yeah.
That's
Go
funny.
ahead,
'Cause
float
there's a lot
away,
of people
yeah.
in Canada
Drop the
that
dead
don't like.
weight.
There's a lot of
Well-
people in Canada that don't like Quebec, but Quebec has enormous political power in Canada.
Wow. Well, isn't that an interesting contrast then?
Yeah.
Well, that's exactly what we're talking about here. That's what I mentioned. So we talked about economic already. Now we're kind of getting into some of the political. And so they have a disproportionate effect for politically speaking with the number of seats that they have versus the amount of economic effect that they have. It is far out of balance. And so that is a major issue. And so we need to talk about some of the poll data and what these polls are showing. And I'm going to ask I got some data here on, we're going to talk about the cultural stuff about Western Canada versus Eastern Canada, but I don't know if anybody wants to get ready to throw some stuff out on that. But I want to mention a couple of these polls here. And so let's go ahead. I got one that we're going to pull up here. Now there's a few different polls. This one here is from Agnes Reed. And so it says, would you vote for your province to leave Canada or stay? Look at these numbers here, 52%. So this is, it says Alberta and Saskatchewan. And so it says definitely would vote to stay. Okay, 52, 30, 49%. And it says lean toward voting to stay. Okay. And then you have leaning toward voting to leave and definitely would vote to leave. So
Wow.
You see these numbers going north of 30% here. North of 30%. And I have a surprise that I'm going to share with you that I think a lot of people do not consider when it comes to these things. And it was a surprise that happened that had Brexit be successful. And I'm going to share that with you here in just a minute. But this is a kind of a mainstream poll. Okay. But if you look at the Western Standard poll, I wasn't actually able to find this. I saw this from Dr. Steve Turley. He's got an incredible channel. But he said the Western Standard poll, as of, this was just recently, I think it was this month, but it said 94% of respondents believe Alberta is being shortchanged by Ottawa. No surprise. 86% of Alberta say Alberta should take further steps toward full sovereignty. That's going down the path there. 87% would vote yes for independence if a referendum were held tomorrow. 87%.
A large percentage.
Any poll that shows 87%, you have to think either they just polled the 87 out of 100 people they know that would vote yes, or
They targeted that very specifically.
there's something going on here. Because even in political bias, and you see something that's at like 60, 70%, that's a little bit suspect. But that's insane. That 87% would vote yes. Okay, 72% believe Premier Danielle Smith and the UCP should lead the sovereignty movement, and 62% say sovereignty should be a core priority for the UCP. Okay, so that's a big deal. Now I'm going to share this difference here. Okay, so what do they need? They lowered the vote. I didn't even mention this, but they have actually lowered the vote to. They did a Bill 54 lowered the referendum petition threshold to 177,000 signatures. So the referendum petition will be on the ballot in 2026. So
That sounds like an easy thing to do, actually.
Yeah, it is an actual thing that will be voted on in 2026.
Wow.
I don't know if that's 100% or most likely. Our Canadian friends, feel free to jump it in there, but it sounded like to me it's a done deal and it will be on there. And so I know the leader of Saskatchewan said that they would not stand in the way of an independence vote. And so this is really going down the track here. Now I want to also give you a page out of Trump's playbook and what might be going on here. But before that, I do want to mention that the thing that they're not considering is that independent referendums are a huge driver for voter turnout. And so people who feel left behind, feel like they're not being represented, well, it's also the Trump effect. And so Trump brought a lot of people out to vote because it was like, oh, this is not just a protest. This is actual leverage. This is actually things could change and come back to we the people. So let's go out and vote. So more people went and voted. And that's what happened in Brexit. It drove higher voter turnout, and you can't account for that in polls. And so
it's more sensational is what it seems like.
Well, it's not only more, I mean, it's more sensational, sounds like a surface level thing, but it's actually like, wow, my vote could actually make a difference and actually get this to where it needs to be. And so that's where they're not accounting for that. So I think that's a pretty easy gap to close from 36 to 50%, over 50% with just voter turnout, plus the way that it seems to be trending. And so the thing I wanted to
Mine
mention
went directly to Brexit, because that was it's a huge deal, because it was exactly that. There were so many people that, and to be honest, not all of them were probably like most well informed about what voting for Brexit exactly meant, but it's just that idea of, I am so upset with my country. I really, really, really don't like the way that things are going. And so, yeah, so many people just check out. And they're like, it doesn't matter if I vote for this person or vote for that person, nothing ever changes. And so when you put forward that kind of question, that's like, if enough people vote on this, then this specific thing will happen, and we're leaving this organization. And yeah, so that's what it was in England. It was just like, everybody came out to vote, because anybody that had any, chip on their shoulder with how the UK government was running, and especially the EU, are like, yeah, I'm definitely going to vote for this. And yeah, it's hard to predict how many people are going to have come out motivated by that kind of sense. And again, it doesn't have to be for any particular issue. It hits all these issues. So one person might be upset about this thing over here, and the other person's upset about this, but they're both like, well, if we leave the EU, then we will have more autonomy, and maybe we can solve these things better ourselves. And so it hits all these issues. And I think that Alberta has the chance of that. There's probably a lot of different reasons why people want to leave, the Ottawa federal government, but there's a lot of different reasons. And so it's going to hit so many people being like, oh, we could solve all these issues if we all just leave at the same exact time. That's the mindset.
Right. And so I think I was talking about the Trump effect. Okay. So one of the things that Trump does is he says things that are way out there, bombastic, but it brings the conversation to the forefront. And it's not just, but the thing is, he actually will take the action, as you've seen with tariffs. If the people don't act, then they actually go through with it. And so I think what's happening here at a minimum would be, this is actually, look, this is feasible and we're willing to do it and we're going to go forward with it. And so either they're going to get better representation of what they want in the government, or this could actually go forward. And so the thing is, you have to actually be willing to take the action. And it seems like certainly it is going down this track. And so I got one more area that I want to mention about. We talked about economic, we talked about political a little bit, and I'm going to mention about the cultural differences. And so why that would be the case. And then Troy, we're going to give it to you to give us some details on some of the other things that we need to consider. So think about Western Canada and Eastern Canada. Okay, so if you think about in the U.S., you have conservatives, and you have more liberal or more leftist. And so feel free to add to this, you guys. I know you probably know more about this than I do, but if you think about the political leanings and the cultural leanings of the eastern side of Canada, it's more social welfare, multiculturalism, climate policy, government involvement in the economy, that type of stuff. And on the western side, it's more like a strong emphasis on entrepreneurship, self-reliance, outdoor lifestyle, kind of more hardworking. They call the ignorant, the hardworking people that are ignored by the East, kind of a Western alienation as sort of a recurring theme. And you see this happening in what we call flyover states in the U.S. I mean, it's really nothing different. And so what you have the coastal elites, and then you have everybody in the middle of the country. That is the core of the country. And so in the U.S., we're seeing kind of a similar, or in Canada, we're seeing kind of a similar breakdown. So any thoughts on that before we go to our next point here?
Well, my first thought is the graph you showed earlier. It's like that those beliefs and those values are kind of reflected in some ways. And, I understand that it's like the natural resources that are available in certain areas versus others. But those beliefs and values, I believe, are affected in that graph right there, where it's showing like the more conservative you go, the more traditional value you go when it comes to different provinces in Canada, the more revenue is coming out of that state, that province. And the more liberal you go, the more money they're wasting, and the more in debt that they are technically to the other states or the other provinces as a province. So I just like, I can't, fiscally, liberalism and socialism just doesn't make sense when you actually look at the numbers.
Yeah, and I think
you brought this graph back up really fast. I just wanted to throw out there. I did a tiny bit of research really quick while you were talking about Canada, and I just pulled up. From what I can tell, it looks like there's 19 states in the U.S. that contribute more to the federal government than they receive. So we have a little bit of this kind of situation going on here in the U.S. It's not nearly as bad as Canada, because if you could see the discrepancy there over less than 20-year period. Just massive discrepancy that Alberta is paying way more into the federal government than they're getting back, and way more than than anybody else is paying into, obviously. But it was like here in the U.S. from the article that I pulled up, it looked like we only have like 19 states. Texas is one of them that pays more into the federal government than the federal government turns around and gives back to them. So a little bit better situation here in the States, but similar.
And were those states generally conservative, or was it all over the place?
Oh, it's a big old list, dude. I don't know. Let me look at the list again.
Well, I mean, as you pull that up,
it seems as though the policies of the left require more money to run, and the policies of the right require less and produce more.
We need to do
it's kind of all over the
episode.
place. So here's what I'll say, Doug. I've got the list pulled up over here, but it's kind of all over the place because you have to also think about welfare. And is a little bit of a correlation between some of the poorer states like Alabama and places like that are very conservative, but they're also very poor and they receive lots in welfare. And so it's a mix of more liberal states and more conservative states. And a lot of it probably has to do with the amount of welfare people are receiving in those states. And so, I know what I was saying. Plenty of conservative states in the United States that receive more technically from the federal government. The residents receive more from the federal government than the residents are paying in. So,
and what I was saying was a little bit of an oversimplification, but I know that there's a lot more complexity to it. I was just trying to see if there was anything to point out there.
Well, and we need to understand, just because you have Republicans in lead in a state does not mean it is a conservative state. And so we have a trifecta Republicans in multiple states, trifecta as in the House, the Senate, and the
Bill Clinton came from Arkansas, so.
But I'm just saying it's really more, is this establishment liberal or is it actual conservative leadership? Is it actually being true to the conservative principles? Because you see, like California, they throw away a lot of the natural resources. They just throw it away. Like they shouldn't have a water problem or a drought problem because they throw all their water into the ocean. And I think, and so they literally do. They route it into the ocean to save some fish that, okay, understandable. You want to save a fish, but you destroy a lot of families in the process. And so that's the different priorities. And so I think, Troy, we want to jump into, I don't know if you had anybody else have any other comments before we jump into some more of the hurdles, a special hurdle and psychological stuff that we need to get through.
Yeah, so, no more comments here, but before we jump into that, I'm going to actually play a message from our sponsor, and then we'll get right into what is this major hurdle that has arisen recently, and what are they going to be able to do about it? Investing can be confusing and scary, but it doesn't have to be. Genesis Gold Group takes the guessing out of the game and guides you on your gold investment journey. We at Filibusted love the genius design of the Prepper Bar, which breaks up into sections, kind of like a chocolate bar. But if you prefer high security insured gold storage, they have that too. And unlike Fort Knox, the gold is actually there, 100% owned by you. So don't wait to get started. Visit filibustedgold.com today for a free investment guide from Genesis Gold Group. So a quick thank you to our sponsor, Genesis Gold Group, today. So let's jump into this, Ryan, because you're mentioning this hurdle, and I found this very interesting. This is something, this is a statement from the Confederacy of Treaty Number 6, First Nations in Canada. So this is part of the Indigenous people group in the nation of Canada, and this is a statement that, from what the article I'm reading, this was posted on August 15th, 2025. It says, the Confederacy of Treaty Number 6 First Nations will file an official application to intervene in the courts against a proposed referendum question regarding Alberta separating from Canada. So you talked about how the referendum is on the books to be voted on, to be considered in 2026, but they're trying to shut the referendum down ahead of time in the courts. And here's what they're saying. This is the statement. We will continue our unchanging opposition to separatist rhetoric and the idea that Alberta could consider separating from Canada. The push for separation is a direct violation of treaty, which are sacred and legally binding commitments. It is also unconstitutional, posing a clear threat to Section 35 of the Constitution Act, which protects First Nations rights. This is the big hurdle that I pulled out of this. It's not just another legal issue they have to deal with, but the language here is, they say the push for separation is a direct violation of treaty, which are sacred and legally binding commitments. So this is not just a legal issue, but for the Indigenous people, apparently it's a sacred issue, this treaty between them and the government. And so there's a whole nother aspect that they're going to have to overcome here. There's a whole nother hurdle they're going to have to jump. And it has more to do with the history of Canada and the moral obligations that some people feel they owe to the Indigenous people. And that is going to play into it. And they're going to have to jump a legal hurdle, but also a sacred hurdle in this case. So very interesting. What do y'all think about that?
I'm trying to think of a good comparison, but like if there was a good way to compare that to how we feel here in the States.
Well, so I'm from Texas, but I did live in Oklahoma. I was about to say I'm from Oklahoma. I did live in Oklahoma for 10 years.
I think it's pronounced Texas.
So I do feel a little bit like an Oklahoma native, even though I'm back here in Texas now. So yeah, I think it would be pretty similar, it is in Oklahoma. Oklahoma has, I think, like 39 different tribal nations that are like considered home to be in Oklahoma, and there's a lot of tribal land there, a lot of reservations there. And it would be kind of like similar if Oklahoma was like, okay, we're gonna secede from, the federal government. It's a little bit different because like Oklahoma has itself, I think, agreements with a lot of the tribes there, but also the federal government has agreements with the tribes. And so if Oklahoma specifically would say, like, Oklahoma and Texas joined up and we're like, we're gonna secede from the Union, then there would be a lot of pushback in that area, because it's like, well, you have these agreements with the federal government, but now you don't have this with the new government. My main question here with this whole thing is, it's one of those things that's like, okay, yeah, the Indigenous people are bringing up, well, this is against the Constitution. Well, I guess, is it not against the Constitution for Alberta to be seceding in the first place? Is there actually is like a legal way that they can go about being like, all right, peace out, enough of us are voting and leaving? Because that's where it's like, if there is a legal way for them to do that, then there must be also a legal way for them to untangle themselves from the agreements of Canada, that Canada, the federal government of Canada, has with the Indigenous people. And so if there still is, but obviously I'd see why the Indigenous people are pushing back, because if they have these certain agreements with the federal government, then they're not guaranteed to have that underneath the new nation of Alberta, if Alberta splits off.
There's a path, but it's not easy.
Yeah, it's not easy. So the actual referendum is constitutional, the referendum itself, but the secession referendum needs a clear question of independence. So they need to be able to clearly question the federal government's treatment of them as a province, and say they're not giving us the same independence they're giving the rest of the country. They have to be able to say that, and there has to be a clear majority vote in favor of the referendum. So that has a constitutional path. But that's a very good point, Reese. In order to actually secede after that, it probably would require a constitutional amendment. Yeah. And on top of that, it would trigger negotiations with the federal government in all the different areas of, federal versus state or federal versus province, all the different transactions and everything that takes place. They would have to debate and, negotiate all of those things, each individual one. Yeah, there would be some sort of rapid, illegal, like crazy split that would happen. And, who knows where that would go. But yeah, it is not an easy process.
So in 1998, there was a Supreme Court ruling from I think it was about the secession of Quebec. And it says the court ruled that a province cannot legally secede unilaterally. However, if a province clearly voted to leave through a clear referendum question with a clear majority, the federal government would have a constitutional duty to negotiate with that province. And so that would mean either they would get to independence, or they would perhaps get something that they wanted, so that maybe independence was not an issue that they wanted anymore. And so, but actual cessation would require, I think, constitutional amendments and approval from federal parliament.
But it starts with that referendum.
Yeah, so it is quite the path. But back to your points, though, Troy. When we talk about the Indigenous people, my mind goes to sort of, well, why would they be interested to? Why would they feel so heartfelt about that? Why would they really want to? I mean, is it really those agreements and the spiritual significance of that, or could it perhaps be the federal funding and per capita spending and healthcare and education payments and taxation carve-outs and housing and infrastructure and land and resource rights and maybe self-governing agreements and maybe some funding gaps and dependency versus autonomy and corruption, mismanagement? I mean, I just wonder if any of those could have to do with this. And we could dive into some of these, but there's millions and billions of dollars. And I don't mean to disparage those communities at all. I do want to be very clear. What I'm disparaging is leadership of communities that pretend like it's one thing when it's really another selfish thing. That is what I'm disparaging. And so that to me is what I'm highlighting here. I have respect for those communities. I have no problem with that. It's the issue of the leadership pretending like it's one thing and it's really another, and it's really their selfish interests.
Yeah, the Confederacy of Treaty Number 6, in their statement that they made, what they said was this rhetoric about separating is. They said that they are engaged in playing political games that endanger the future of all Albertans. So that is their perspective. That's their official statement, that they believe that they're endangering the future of all Albertans. That's a very strong statement. They obviously have very strong feelings about it. But what is behind those feelings? Like that is, it's like they did not state why. They didn't state the why. They didn't state the details. So it's kind of, it's
a standard political talking point that you generalize with no specifics supporting it. And then people just take it and run with it. And they say, wow, yeah, well, if you cared about the Albertans, then you wouldn't want to secede. You wouldn't want independence. Well, then wait a minute. We care about we do care about them. That's why we want to have independence, because we're being taken advantage of by the rest of everybody else. And so that's my initial thoughts. I mean, that's where my head goes, but
it speaks back to the problems with, and again, and it's always a funky issue, because it's like not to be insensitive to the historical plights of Native Americans in the United States, but it speaks back to a lot of the same issues that we have here in the U.S. when you have different people in the same country governed as if they were underneath different governments. And so like the Indian reservations are that are across the United States in different places. Several of them are in Oklahoma. They have lots of different issues, and part of one of the issues is the fact of jurisdiction, of like if a crime is committed, for instance. This is actually a huge deal in the United States. A lot of murders on Indian reservations go unsolved because of an issue with jurisdiction. Usually, initially, the state is what is supposed to be. If there's a crime done, the state is police and the county police and all that kind of the state is, and the local governments are responsible for coming in and investigating the crime and prosecuting people. But if it's done on tribal land, that's actually under the purview of the federal government in most cases. And so now it's an issue for the FBI. But the FBI does not focus on solving murders that were done on reservations or crime done on reservations. And then you have it's a weird, different country inside of a country that has all these own issues. You can get into, the welfare usually connects to a lot of bad issues, like the rates of drinking, alcoholism, and all kinds of other issues that you have going on there. It's one of those situations where it's like, I understand there's a want and a desire to preserve a certain culture and a certain way of life. But as far as the legal system goes, and then there's even also the issue of the tribal ownership of the land instead of the individuals owning land, because then the individuals be like, well, I want to, buy a house or do this or do that. And it's like, they don't own anything because the whole tribe owns the land. And so they can't put up their property for, to be able to get a business loan or that kind of thing. There's all those kind of issues. I'm assuming they probably have very similar ones that are happening in Canada as well. But yeah, it's definitely a sticky situation that you get into, and it would be much simpler if the same rules applied to everybody in your country across the board, and that was just the way that it was.
Yeah. No, I think those are interesting points. Here's a comment from Sam saying Quebec wanted to separate. So in 1992, there was a Canada-wide referendum. Quebec needed a Canada-wide majority to separate. Alberta would probably need a Canada-wide majority for them to leave. So it would be very, very, very difficult. But the point that we raised earlier, that I think maybe even a better path than separation, and I know the people that really want to separate probably don't like me for saying that, would be to restore some of the political power back to some of these conservative provinces that have kind of lost the power, to the liberal side, right? And so here's where I want to go with it now, because I think this is something that a lot of the people that are saying secede maybe have thought through, maybe not, and I live in Texas in the United States, and we are very, very infamous for throwing the word secede around anytime things don't go our way, right?
Yeah, I was
We're
going to
like,
say, if we start talking about
right?
the personal attachment to this, so like we got to talk about the Texas piece.
We use it kind of like how an adult, once your kid gets past the spanking stage and you don't really spank them anymore, but you say all the time, like, you're gonna get spanking. That's how Texas uses the secede.
I just want to say that I'm remote here. If we were in the same room during this podcast, I wouldn't be so upfront about Texas. I don't have a revolver with me like you guys might, but that's the case. So I do have cowboy boots. I do like that, and not that that's a stereotype or anything, but
yeah. I was in New Zealand and they said, and I said, I'm from Texas. And they said, we love Texas. Where's your cowboy boots and your cowboy hat?
Yeah.
And I was like,
every single person wears them.
I was not expecting that question. So
I do want to say, like, we drove from Iowa down to South Padre, and it is such a big state that we got to Texas from Iowa and we were like almost halfway to the destination. So the entire state of Texas was half of the drive. So that's fascinating. Very big state.
A long time to get through Texas.
Technically, we're not talking about Texas today, but I'm using it to frame this question: is what would the psychological effects of seceding, or even potentially seceding, like trying to get to the end of that race, trying to get to that finish line, what would that look like for the province in general, that was trying to secede, but also the families involved, the individuals involved. And I'm wondering what kind of emotional effects would come along with that. So I'm just going to throw my 2 cents out there. This is my initial reaction. If Texas was trying to actually secede from the United States, if Texas randomly said, because that's where I live, so that's my reference, they said, we're doing this, we're going to push this along. We don't know if it's going to be peaceful or not. I would be like, wait a minute. I have 5 kids and a wife, and I don't know if I want to be around, like that. My thoughts would go towards, one day I'm feeling loyal to Texas. I'm like, yeah, let's take up arms and let's get, if we need to, the next day I'd be like, but I'm also I'm also an American. I'm also the United States of America is my country. So is my loyalty there, but I'm also loyal to my family first. So do I pick up my roots and go settle somewhere else before Texas tries to, it's like all these questions are going through my mind. I'm like, what would I actually do? And I think that's why when you showed that graph earlier where it says a certain percentage is saying, yes, we would likely vote to leave. And then there's another similar percentage that says, around 17-18% that they lean towards voting to leave. And then there's 19-15 that says definitely would vote to leave. Out of these 2 provinces, Saskatchewan and Alberta. Then it's like, it makes sense to me why a lot of those people are very hesitant, even the ones that can see the positives or the benefits, or they can see the problems, that they're experiencing right now and being part of the rest of Canada. They're very hesitant. And I think it probably has to do a lot with the psychological issues that you would walk through attempting to make an actual change like this, not just talking about it, not just making jokes about it, but actually doing it, So what are y'all's thoughts on that? And then, I also want to hear if there are any Canadians. I know we have a few Canadians watching in the chat. Y'all let us know what your thoughts on it. And I'm not just talking about, I really love it or I really don't. That's great. But also, like, what are the psychological issues you would have to walk through? What are your fears if you're, that you would have to walk through if your province is actually trying to leave, or your joys, your excitement, like that kind of thing?
I think it would depend on how civilized the process is, whether or not it stays in the courts and stays a political thing, or if it gets more physical. Because if it gets more physical, like we're talking literal civil war of some sort, then I've got more of a problem with it. Obviously, I'm not for that. That is not something I want to be a part of. But if it were somehow to remain civilized, then I think that it's a bigger, better discussion. And I have a hard time imagining something like, in your example, Texas seceding, that going to civil war, because it just doesn't even sound smart. Because I mean, Texas is a big state, but it's not as big as the rest of the U.S. We would not be able to stand up against the military of the rest of the U.S. That
Right.
doesn't even like logically make sense. Which brings me to the conclusion that if it were to be successful, it couldn't be a physical war like that, because we would be destroying. I know that, you know, you can use the actual Civil War as an example of how we did destroy each other. But mostly, you know, the South having the destruction. But it's still a different age. And we have different weapons, we have different technologies, and it just would be a no contest, you know, I think anyway. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Maybe Texas has a bigger military than I realize, but I don't think, I think that just simply because it was that, was
finish what you're saying. I'm glad you popped that up there. I was going to mention, did you finish what you're saying? And then I have a comment.
I was just saying that my final point is just simply because of the fact that it would have to, there is no contest. I don't think it would go to that, which means it would stay civil, which opens up the possibilities for a more like easy transition into whatever that means. And I would imagine it would be the same case in Canada.
Right. My second thought after that would be, what would this affect my family's like way of life, like our quality of life? Right. Would it go up after that? Would it go down? You know, like, am I willing to take that risk? You know, even if it's not likely that we would come to blows, you know, even if it's not likely that it would become that, am I willing
would
to
it just take a hit for a minute? We would have like some sort of recession and then come out of it and be fine on the other end. And how hard would that hit be? Am I willing to suffer through that? Yeah, that's a lot to consider.
And then you have thoughts like somebody just threw a comment out there a few minutes ago about a potential tariff situation. You know, like the United States, like, okay, now we're going to hit Texas with tariffs.
Yeah,
you know?
I think
so.
Go for it, Ryan.
Well, I just think that, you know, in our mind, we have the way that things should go. And I think there's a big identity part of this. Like, I think Texas is one of the states that obviously, you know, I'm from Texas, or I'm from Tennessee, or I'm from Bama, or, you know, there's like a lot of personal identity wrapped up in the state. And so I'm not familiar with, you know, how that is for Alberta, but there's a bigger identity that we're American, and it is like a beacon of freedom around the world. And so it is kind of like, even if it's not faithfully represented with certain governments as they come and go, there's still a greater identity there. And so if you really have that identity, and if it is really a sharp contrast in Canada between the Canadian and Alberta, then, you know, you might see how that could happen. But I think that a lot of people, when they see what it would actually take to go through that, and they get into the practicals and the particulars and the long path to that, it's like, well, maybe that's not the best way to get what we want, but maybe we need to start that process so that we can open up to negotiate more of that federal power that we're looking for, so that we're more faithfully represented. And so I think in that case, it would make sense to go down that path. Now, before we close, we don't have to do it right now, but I need to make a statement on Texas. But go ahead and
well, you can save that statement for a little bit. On the interesting psychological piece to this would be the fact that there's definitely something to be said for home rule. So Alberta, you know, is similar to Texas in the fact that Texas has a massive GDP, and I don't know what Alberta's is much lower. But Texas is just so ginormous. So if Texas was its own country, it would be the 8th largest economy in the world. If it was its own country, Texas just has a massive, massive economy. Texas and California are at the top for the United States. But Alberta is similar in that aspect of like, they have this massive GDP, and so they could potentially swing this, because if they went their own way, there'd be the initial very difficult issues with the trade and that kind of thing. And so connecting it to the personal piece, so if your family is there in Alberta or here in Texas, and there's secession going on, then it's like, okay, well, will I still be able to work for my company if my company's not based in this country anymore? You know, all this, if this new country is now at odds with the old country that was a part of, you know, we're going to have less trade, we're going to have less ties, we're going to have all these kinds of things. So that's the negative aspect that you're looking at. The positive aspect that you're looking at, though, I think this actually has a positive psychological effect, and even did so in Britain, although their ruling class basically has punished them for voting Brexit. But amongst the British people in Brexit who felt like their power was out of their hands, and that their country was going somewhere that they didn't want it to go and felt like it was too much power was in the hands of the EU and not actually in England. It basically prompted a hopefulness of like, we're now bringing, so like here in the United States, the example is always given, we're ruled by people that live all the way over on the East Coast that have no interaction with our day-to-day lives and what it's like to live here in Texas, Oklahoma, Alabama, whatever, the middle states, that kind of thing. But when you bring the power dynamic to my political figures, my governmental figures, the people that rule over me live down the street from me. They live in the same city as me. They live in the same state as me. They're literally right here. I think Ryan mentioned it is a cultural thing all of a sudden, because it allows you to have a strong central culture, central like collective story of your country, of your state. This is why there's some like micronations in Europe that do really, really well. And part of the reason is because it's like one massive family. Everybody has the same values. Everybody has the same culture. You can't really be a greedy, corrupt politician because it's a tiny nation and everybody knows who you are. It's like, you can't do that kind of thing. It just doesn't work because it's just geographically it's too small. And so I think that's where, if it did happen, like if something happened in Texas, I would have some excitement, not because I actually want Texas to leave, but it would, because I don't think that would actually be the best thing. But if it was happening, I would be excited to see the changes, because it'd be so interesting to be part of a project that was like, wow, we're making a new nation here. And I don't know, maybe I'm like an adrenaline junkie and I'm just always up for something new. And I also don't have kids and
that's my adrenaline fix.
I wouldn't be quite as concerned about how is this going to affect my family, because I'm like, well, I don't have to. People aren't really. I'm not responsible for, small
other humans.
But I think that I'd be interested to see if Alberta continues going down this path, if they develop a stronger sense of what it means to be Albertan.
I will say this. Go ahead, Troy.
No, you go first, Doug, and then I'll chime in.
Okay. I don't know how relevant this is to Canada, but I will say it does actually depend on the way the rest of the country goes federally. For example, if Gavin Newsom ever did become president, then we have a whole different story and a whole different approach to it as well. I would be a lot more open to any form of secession at that point, because at that point it will be Texas versus California being the rest of
and it would be probably longer than a 4-year process.
I think that points to this question that Rashun, I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, but they said, to me, this brings a question. What is the line where you finally say, now I am okay with actual fighting?
Gavin
so what
Newsom,
would that line look like? You can look at the Civil War.
Very clear.
You can look at the Civil War.
I think the line is way before Gavin Newsom, but yeah.
But I think for me, it would be past Gavin Newsom being president. I think that wouldn't warrant it yet.
I don't know, man. You haven't lived.
That would be a very there would have to be some extremely oppressive measures taken before I would ever consider that personally. Like for me, I know some people, I think that line is sooner, but.
Well, there's been a chipping away of things in the U.S. over the last 20 years that would put things in place for that, like surveillance state that's been secretly set up since 2002, I think. So anyway,
we're going to do a whole nother episode about that pretty soon, which I'm excited about. But here's another question. Here's another thought that Reese's comments put into my brain, which is, okay, what happens when you secede and you have what happens to the extended families that are spread across, and friends that are spread across the different provinces? It's not just like, well, forget you, rest of Canada, but think about the extreme examples, which would be North and South Korea, the Berlin Wall, where it's like, I haven't seen my loved one in 10 years because there's a wall between us and I'm not allowed to go over there.
I think I know what you're saying. I think that's a bit of an extreme.
But you also look at Europe. Europe people drive.
Okay, Europe is not a good example though, because if Alberta left Canada, that is not the European Union is not that's not going to be the situation that they have. I think the closer example to what you're talking about, Troy,
somewhere between North and South Korea and the European Union, somewhere between those two as well.
Well, I'm saying that's the extreme, but
maybe closer to the U.
I'm talking about the risk involved with seceding would be, we don't know exactly what the country to country relations would look like after that. Right. And how easy it would be for me to go see my loved ones. Like that would be That would be the question.
It's
You know?
real
I have a
questions. I
real
mean-
world example of what this would kind of look like, and we have this problem right now, actually, between the United States and Canada. And so I don't live up north. Obviously, I'm as far away from Canada as you can get. But I have heard and I've read about this, that apparently there is definitely some issues with people living right along the border and border towns, because if you live close to the border, whether you're in Canada or the United States, you know, you can't you can go between, right? You can travel across. But if you're traveling across and you know, the cultures are just so similar, like you're all speaking English, Northerners are very similar to Southern Canadians, you know, it's kind of like a, it's not like a really
There's a blend there.
Split there, language barrier and stuff like that. And so you have like family members, you have people getting married, people dating each other, people getting jobs. They're like, well, I could get a job in this Canadian town, even though I live here in the United States, and they're driving over. And a lot of that is actually why I think we need to be renegotiating some of our trade deals and working deals with Canada, because what they have found is it's actually extremely inconvenient to have any kind of business relations and family relations between Canada and the United States. Things like visas and work visas and all that kind of stuff is really, really hard to come by. Really hard to come by. In fact, if you get married to somebody that's like in Canada, like it can be really hard to bring them, or vice versa. It can be really hard to bring them into your country. Like all that stuff is really difficult, which you think would be kind of nuts, or like it's really hard to keep a job from one across the border from one to the other. You think it would be easy, like if you live there and be like, Canada's right there, we're so similar, we're trading partners. Like, how come this process isn't just like a little bit easier? The main reason it's not easy is because most of that stuff is set up by a trilateral agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. A trilateral agreement. So whatever applies to Canada also applies to Mexico.
Wow.
I'd mentioned, I think earlier on a different podcast, Mexico, unfortunately, is run by drug cartels and is not the kind of stable nation that Canada is. And so there is actually the fact that whatever we apply to Canada has to then be applied to Mexico, has kept the United States from being like, okay, let's ease up and make this a little bit easier so people can go across the border between Canada and the United States.
I think
do the family stuff or whatever. So if we remove ourselves from that trilateral agreement and directly connect ourselves to the United States and Canada, I think that would be better. Now, Canada still has some issues they have to deal with their border as far as border security goes, because they have drugs and stuff going across. But I think we could ease up on the visas essentially and the trade.
Well, I'm not sure what visas you're talking about, because you don't need a visa to go to Canada. You're talking about for work specific stuff.
Yeah, for like working stuff, and then like
because
bringing, like if you get married from across
if you're 15 feet away from a job opportunity and you have to get a visa to get that job, you're going to try to do it, right?
Well, I mean, okay, so let's talk about I mean, some of this I think is true, but the thing is, it's also another country, and so like that. It's also not just because of the trilateral thing. It's also because it's another country and it applies to every single country. And so like my wife is from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. She can't just come here and get married. There's a process to go through for that. So it would be the same process for Canada or for Brazil or for another country. And so it, based on, and that person needs to, you got to prove a lot of stuff. But I have a little card. It's called a passport card. And you just drive across the border and you just go and you just show that to the guy and you drive back and forth between Canada. And that's the same for Canada or for Mexico.
Right. But what I'm saying is we could and like your case, Brazil is much farther away from the United States than Canada. Like for people that are states along the border, or even just as the nations, we could ease up essentially the ability for us to like work between the two nations. If we had better
for work, I would agree. For immigration, I would say no, because you don't have you don't have them in your system. You don't have the records and that sort of stuff. But yeah, no, I agree with that.
But a similar thing would occur if Alberta left Canada. I'm just saying, all of a sudden you would have, a lot of things to consider. Over here, or I was close to the corner of Alberta, or I worked in these other provinces, and now all of a sudden, now you have, I would be an even stickier situation to work through. Absolutely,
yeah, a lot of things that need to be worked out.
Ryan, you have a twist, right, for us, right? Or something that. Am I putting you on the spot right now? You don't have a twist?
little bit. My twist is going to be about Texas, I guess, but I'm going to have to find something else. So we're talking about Canada here, but while you think of our twist here, I'm going to go ahead and tell my Texas spiel. So here's the deal. I want to make sure I'm not representing myself incorrectly about Texas here. In fact, do you know what the actual state sport of Texas is? It's rodeo. It is bull riding. And I used to, I have ridden bulls. In fact, I rode bulls and what do you call it? I don't think I had a cumulative 8 seconds. It's very difficult to ride bulls. But it's something, I don't know what I was thinking, but I got the lessons and I did it. But anyway, I wore cowboy boots in my high school, and somebody complained. We had a, what do you call it? A dress code in high school. And somebody complained to the physics teacher. They said, hey, he's not following the dress code. You need to get Ryan in trouble, give him detention, and da-da-da. That's not formal. And my teacher said, was it formal when the President Bush wore the boots to his inauguration? And they didn't really have anything to say. And I was like, well, I guess I'm wearing boots tomorrow also. So go sit back down. And so, yeah, I'm a fan. I was big into cowboy culture and all that kind of. I went to Cheyenne, Wyoming, and all the rodeos and all that stuff. So I love Texas. I like to make fun of anything. So that's a lot of fun.
You're more Texan than me. I have never ridden on a bull. I did help with a rodeo one time.
I have a video of it. Maybe we can share that sometime. But I fell off of it. So they tell you,
we definitely should
look at the back. Look at the back. Do not look out. But as soon as they opened the gate, I looked out. And the bull took off, and as soon as it turned, I just fell right off, and both hooves went right in the middle of my back. And so that was my introduction to bull riding. Fortunately, I had safety gear on. So anyway,
vote in the comments if you want to see Ryan riding a bull.
Bull riding.
Let us know.
I think
flying off a bull.
I think we're going to finish with that bit of information. And just so you all know, if you're in Canada, you do not have to miss out. You too can test your nerves of steel against a bull at the Calgary Stampede. They actually have bull riding in Canada. So
really,
it's not just Texas.
That's awesome.
And so any final closing remarks before we finish, y'all?
I don't think so.
I think my only final closing remark is it does seem like this is going to be a really crazy, difficult battle. But I'm glad that they're doing it because they obviously need a shift of balance of power, like the more conservative provinces. And this is something that they can do in order to force the federal government to begin to make changes and to have a balance of power shifted back. If there was another thing that they could do in Canada that would help the balance of power, is they need to do away with the requirement that you have to know both English and French in order to run and hold positions in the federal government. Because that's part of the reason why Quebec has as much power as they do, because Quebec is the French speaking part of it, and because both English
way
and
to get
French are both the national languages, the official national languages. You have to know both in order to basically.
I'm assuming those on the west don't know it as much,
right? And so people in the western provinces don't know French. They wouldn't have any reason to know French, and the only reason that they would force themselves to learn French is literally so they could go into politics. So there's a slight unfair edge there that Quebec has. But
that's a really, really good point. Well, thank y'all for joining us today.
My final thought.
Ryan, I'm going to cut you off again, man. Let's hear your closing remark.
Yes. So, I thought, Doug, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add, but final thing I would say is, I think we've uncovered a lot here that actually doesn't meet the eye at first when you think about this. And so it is clear that it is quite complicated. There's lots of things to consider. Perhaps cessation is not the best idea, but there definitely needs to be some change. And I think going down the path towards cessation in a serious sense, as though that is going to be what they're going to do, and really have that intention in order to get what they need and what they want, so that it's better represented, I think is a good path to go. I've visited Canada many times. I've worked with Canada and businesses in Canada, and I just we want what's best for Canada. We want what's best for down here in the U.S. also, and so we hope a lot of Canadians are going to keep weighing in here on our comments, and make sure you go ahead and get our exclusive episodes, and go ahead and make sure that you're also checking out locals, and stay in touch. Keep us in the loop with what's going on, what you want to see, and what you like. So, Troy, any final comments?
None from me, Doug.
I'm good, man. It's a good
conversation. All right. Well, thank y'all for joining us, and we'll see you again next time. Gold is not just a backup plan if the world falls apart. It's an investment opportunity that could set you up for generations. There's never really a bad time to invest in gold, but you want to make sure you have the right guide. And that is where Genesis Gold Group shines. Whether you are a first-time buyer or a seasoned investor, their trusted expertise and competitive pricing makes them an easy choice. They offer tangible assets in case of emergencies, but they can also design the perfect IRA just for you. And they'll even cut through all that confusing red tape from the IRS. We at Filibusted love the genius design of the Prepper Bar, which breaks up into sections like a chocolate bar. But if you prefer a more high security insured gold storage, they have that too. And unlike Fort Knox, the gold is actually there and 100% owned by you. Genesis Gold Group is a safe, simple, and convenient way to invest. Visit filibustedgold.com today for your free investment guide from Genesis Gold Group.